Welcome to Allegedly Doesn't Replicate, a podcast by the Institute for Replication, where we put research to the test again. In this episode, we'll have John Ioannidis talking about why most research is wrong.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Juan Pablo. I'm joined here with our co-host, Abel Brodeur, and we have an incredible special guest today, John Ioannidis. He's a professor of medicine at Stanford Medical School. I'm going to let John introduce himself, but we're going to have a very special episode talking about one of the seminal papers of open science, and it's going to be very exciting. So, John, hello. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you for the very kind invitation. Very happy to join you.
So, John, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? Who are you? What do you work on this stuff? A bit of everything. Let us, our audience, know a bit about yourself.
Goodness, I'm very unfocused, trying to be a scientist, meaning that I make lots of mistakes and I try to correct them. I love methods and I try to improve methods. I love to try to understand biases and to try to prevent or correct or avoid biases. I run the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford, which is a research on research type of initiative, trying to understand how research methods work or dysfunction and how we can avoid some of that dysfunction and make things better.
That's it. Super interesting. John, you have one of the coolest papers I've ever read. And I was just telling Abel that one of the coolest things about this paper is that it doesn't read like a paper. And what I mean by that is that it just reads as a very academic essay in a sense. So when I was just looking into the world of metascience and doing research about research, this is, of course, one of the first papers that comes along. And I think it's so cool from the very start because the title of the paper is Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, which is very bold on itself. We were wondering, how did you came up to that conclusion and what drove you to write such an amazing paper in 2005? Because like the open science movement has gained a lot of traction in the last couple of years, but one could imagine that in 2005 it was a very different thing to just say this out loud. So why don't you tell us a bit about the backstory of the paper? How did you came to wrote it and all this stuff?
I think that paper was not something that came completely out of the blue because both myself and several other scientists had been interested and puzzled and troubled about biases and conflicts and problems with replication, problems with reproducibility. I have to go back at least one decade or two to the beginning of the movement of evidence-based medicine within the medical sciences, where lots of us thought that we need to see what evidence we have and try to put it together and put it to good use. Evidence-based medicine was coined at McMaster around early 1990s. I was in training at that time. In 1992, the Cochrane collaboration was launched. Lots of enthusiasm about understanding what we know and what we do not know and how can we can put what we know to good use. Very quickly, both myself and others were disillusioned by realizing that much of what we thought we knew was not there, that we had less evidence than we needed, that we had more biases than we could afford, that we had a very conflicted agenda very often in the biomedical sciences, and increasingly we were seeing that there was spillover of these problems in other fields where some other scientists were probing. So in 2005, when I published that paper, basically I was struggling with these issues for quite a while. I already had experience in different medical fields and in different efforts to try to appraise evidence and generate evidence. I had seen both success stories. For example, at NIH, I had been there at a time when we run some very large randomized trials, including ACTG 320, that managed to change the course of HIV infection from a lethal disease to something that can be managed and have a normal life expectancy, as well as major failures and major disappointments in various aspects of medicine, epidemiology, public health, and you name it. So I had been thinking about this issue for a long time. And the 2005 paper was an effort to put together some of this accumulating sensitization in a format that would try to cover the major aspects of what can go wrong, including both statistical aspects as well as sociology of science and funding and replication, and have a mathematical machinery to try to explain why we are in this type of situation. Why is it so easy to get it wrong? Why is it so easy to get results that are not likely to be reflecting the truth, and if we try to replicate them very often, we do not get the same results. And also make some suggestions on how we could overcome some of these problems. If we can map them, then that might be the first step to try to overcome them. So this is how that paper came about. I was chair of epidemiology at a medical school in Greece at that time, and still had links to the US where I had trained. And I was continuously disillusioned with all that mass of irreproducible information and biased information that I was seeing right and left. So instead of getting antidepressants, which probably would not have worked, I decided to write this paper.
But when you're writing this paper, do you know at the time what's going to be the reaction? Are you thinking about it? Are you thinking like, what's going to be the reaction of my colleagues? Do you present this paper internally? Do you talk to people like, hey, I'm thinking of writing this piece with this bold title? Or you're sort of just, let's write this quickly. Let's just get this out of my system, and then we'll see what happens. What do you think? Are you thinking there's going to be a big reaction to this, or you're sort of not thinking too much about it and just, I'll just write this piece, going to be feeling better inside of myself with what's going on, pointing out problems, and hopefully this leads to a better world where we're having a conversation about like, how can we fix all these problems and why do we have all these problems?
I think that this paper was maturing over at least several years, but the core of the paper was written very quickly while I was in a little Greek island called Sikinos in the Aegean, almost like an abandoned island. It has very few people, and back then, before the onslaught of hypertourism, it was even more remote and difficult to reach, and even more quiet. So the core of the paper was written very, very quickly because the idea had matured, but probably the maturation took much, much longer. I think that I always faced some internal backlash when I tried to convey some disruptive idea. I think that all scientists have the same feeling of how much of that will be tolerated and how much of that will be seen as extreme or a maverick statement. And I was very happy when I wrote that paper because I felt that I could express these ideas in a way that hopefully they would be constructive rather than seen as yet another scream in the sky that there's something wrong. Now, was I correct or wrong about it? I think that some people liked it, some others probably not so much. Time will tell whether that paper did really make some contribution, like in anything in science. I think I have been pleasantly surprised to see that so many people over the years have switched to thinking about problems in research in fundamental ways with very rigorous science, not just exclamations or complaints or kind of extreme statements, which we also have lots of that at the moment. And it's always a challenge to separate good science from some sort of even political statements or polarization statements that see.
That's incredible. For people who are wondering what the paper basically says, is that if you take all the biases and all the pitfalls that could be lingering around a research idea or a project, if you make the math, you end up with a very simple idea: is that most of the research that is published is wrong, right? And that's an incredible statement. But I wanted to ask you something, because economics is like the little brother of medicine, or social sciences is like the little brother of medicine when it comes to evidence-based stuff. So we took inspiration from medicine for RCTs, we took inspiration from medicine for a bunch of stuff, and the movement towards evidence-based policymaking is evidently a step apart from evidence-based medicine, right? What do you think about the statement that comes from some people that it's better to have weak evidence than no evidence at all? Because I take issue with that statement a bit, just because it could stain the trainment and the profession for several years, and we don't know where the ripples could end. So I have a lot of doctor friends, like I would say like real doctors, like my wife, she's a medical doctor. And she often shows me the research that is being done in medicine, and I show her the research that is being done in the social sciences. And we end up with this discussion that perhaps this little paper that is not so well identified, and we don't know whether it's true or not, could end up having ripples in the profession over time. And our friends at the psychology departments know this very well. So, what do you think about this phenomenon?
I think it's better to have weak evidence than no evidence, provided that we recognize that the evidence is weak. And therefore, when it comes to interpreting it, translating it, making sense, and perhaps acting on it, we know that this is weak evidence, and our action and translation needs to be accommodated based on that evaluation. The second problem is compromising with weak evidence. So kind of saying, well, everyone has been fine with getting this level of very weak documentation and very problematic information, and it's easy to do, and we have done that in the past, so let's do more of that. I think that that's the second problem. If we kind of compromise and calibrate our expectations based on the very weak and biased evidence that surrounds us. If we do not compromise, and if we do assess and recognize that this is weak evidence, and we do try to get better evidence, stronger evidence, yes, evidence is never perfect. It's an evolving effort, and sometimes maybe even with weak evidence, we can make some sensible decisions that may be reasonable, and hopefully they will get us more benefit than harm. It's hard to compare different fields like medicine and economics. Sometimes we do that in some of the meta research work that we do, kind of comparatively map their features and their performance and how well they do or how poorly they do. We don't do that to criticize scientific fields as you're the worst field or this is the best field, because obviously different fields meet different challenges. The ability to run randomized trials, for example, is not the same across every scientific field, and it's not the same for all types of questions. There's many questions that we cannot get randomized trials on, for example, when we don't have equipoise, when we feel that there's harmful interventions that need to be assessed somehow. And this doesn't mean that these fields or these questions are not good enough or are not interesting or not important to try to answer. Understanding that the evidence is weak does not mean that we discard evidence. We keep it, we assess it, we put it into some sort of temperance, let's say credibility filtering, and we try to make the best of it.
John, I have a related question. There's a lot of people, I think, that don't necessarily like the work that you're doing or that I'm doing because they think that we're not helping the credibility of scientists. And there's a lot of, and I would say a lot of researchers and also, granting funding agencies and NGOs that are deeply preoccupied by the lack of trust in scientists and scientific results. And I think especially during and after the pandemic, we've had a lot of public discourse about this. I have my personal response to this, and I have my personal thoughts on how to respond to this, and why I think that the work that I'm doing and that you're doing and is really important. But I'd be curious, like, what are your views on this, and what do you respond usually to people who are saying, we should try to improve and try to make people believe that scientists were doing really useful work, even when, let's say, the evidence is only, maybe not great, but this is what we have, and maybe it's going to be limited but useful. So what do you respond to something like this?
I think it is a disservice to science to try to sell what we have as being more credible or more trustworthy or less biased than it really is. I think that this is exactly the recipe to lose trust from the general public, and this is really what has happened to a large extent. We have tried over the years to present science as very powerful, as some new sort of dogma, as something that you believe in rather than think about and provide evidence and data and scrutinize data. And this hasn't really done much good to science. It has alienated lots of people. Whenever we fail, and it's very likely to fail. I mean, science is not perfect. It's an iterative self-correcting process. The failure becomes even more visible, and it has more repercussions because it has been seen as, you told me you're so perfect. You told me you're so great, and now you fail so miserably. So I think it's a disservice to science to try to oversell science. At the same time, I believe that meta-research is not really separate from research. It is, or it should be, a very integral part of research. I would say it's really the machinery of the scientific method, the machinery of what is really important about research. So saying that a scientist is kind of poised against scientific method, or how to control biases, or how to design a good study, then what is a scientist doing really? I mean, do they just submit press releases and talk to the press? So meta research is in the core of science, in the core of doing research. And I also worry a little bit, or more than a little bit, on the other side when I see several people now who want to do meta research and they see themselves as critics who are detached from scientific work. They just become meta researchers to be critics, which I also find very problematic. You may find lots of biases and lots of problems that need to be criticized and need to be fixed, but the starting point should not be uh, kind of making a god out of science, or making a complete disaster to be criticized out of science. Look at the evidence, and sometimes it may be good, sometimes it may be strong, other times it may be weak. You always try to think how it can be improved, and this is very central in doing science. I think it should be something that every scientist should be interested in and should accommodate within their everyday work.
That's incredibly interesting. So, what do you think this means for the general availability of science to the layman person? Like, because one of the conclusions or the that you reached in your paper is that we should be very open and critic with evidence and papers and stuff. Do you think we as scientists have put ourselves into a corner or an echo chamber of sorts when we're only speaking to each other in this weird jargon, and so we're alienating the general population from the discussions that are being held within science, and that's making us untrustworthy, quote unquote, for the general population?
I think it can go both ways. Sometimes we are detached in an elitist frame, and other times we're over involved with the general population and trying to affect what they do, what they think, what they should do. So I have worked in different fields, some of them very esoteric, like mathematical statistics, where you can only have a couple of people be interested in what you're doing, and still the debates can be very aggressive and vehement. And this is fine, provided that you keep it at a professional level. It doesn't become personal. All the way to public health issues, where it could be that the entire population, 8 billion people, may be involved, and many of them will be involved because some of the outcomes of research and some of what is provided as quote unquote knowledge or action plan affects their everyday lives, affects how they live, what they can do, what they cannot do, what is mandated of them to do. So in that situation, it's unavoidable that a large share of the population will engage, no matter what kind of boundaries and what kind of walls we try to erect. They will engage, and they will break these walls, and sometimes they will break them in very powerful ways. And then you have to try to work with a very precarious situation, because very often the discussion goes beyond scientific argumentation, and you have many other entities, politics, influencers, media, social media, having the upper hand in the argumentation. So I'm more in favor of being engaged, and being engaged in unconflicted ways, in transparent ways, and allowing science to be a universal phenomenon. Everyone might be interested in science. Perhaps some of the mathematical statistics questions might not interest too many people. Perhaps nutrition would interest far more. Perhaps handling a pandemic would interest almost everyone. This is okay, but it's important to separate how much of the material circulating in the discussion is scientific information, evidence, how trustworthy it is, and how much of that is opinion, and perhaps even more so distorted opinion, or misguided opinion, or a conflicted opinion. I have no problem to have all of that in the mix, provided that we can recognize what is what. I don't believe in suppressing people's thinking or expression or willingness and freedom to think and speak and make sense. But it's important to try to keep the scientific core as immune as possible from ideologies and from non-scientific influences. People can do whatever they want with that. It's a shared decision-making process, both in medicine and in economics and in other fields. But it's good to be able to keep some independence in the scientific machinery.
How do we do that? I mean, I really like the idea of we need to clearly label what is science, what's opinion piece, what's really this is a conversation among scientists, and potentially then you have reporters who take this, they need to report some of it in non-jargonish way, and then this is consumed by the public. So how do we do this as a scientific community to really clearly label? I mean, do we want journals at all? I don't know. Do we want journals like Nature to also have social media accounts and that publish a lot of opinion piece, but if it's clearly labeled, it's okay? How do we navigate this and just everyone having an opinion? Some scientists don't want to really engage at all with policymakers, others want. How do we navigate this beautiful mess that is science?
It is not easy to navigate, and I don't have a perfect recipe for that. I think that transparency would work. And you asked about Nature or other top journals having a journalistic side or a magazine side. It depends on how this is handled. We have looked, for example, on who is publishing in Nature and what is being published in Nature. And we've seen that both for Nature and Science and top medical journals like BMJ and Lancet and JAMA, there's thousands of journalistic pieces that are being published in their pages. And very often for the average person, they may not be able to tell that this is a journalistic or editorial piece versus this is more hardcore data-based scientific information. There's several people, we have published that, showing that many authors have published more than 200 pieces in Nature or Science or BMJ. Some have published more than 700. Some have published thousands of items in these journals, where an average scientist would see it as the culmination of their career to publish even a single paper. Some of these items are just short news items, so maybe that's easy to tell, but even then, they carry the imprimatur and the name of Nature and Science. Many others are long features. They could be longer than the regular original articles, and literally they're written overnight. The editor-in-chief reaches out to one of the staff members, one of the contracted journalists, and they say, I want a piece on that by tomorrow, literally. And then it will be published within a day or two, while a peer-reviewed article on the same topic may take months or years to get through peer review and eventually get published. Most of the time not in the same caliber of impact factor type of journal. So very often I have found myself, and many other scientists have found themselves, in a situation where these major journals, based on whatever is the partisan position of their editor-in-chief or their staff or their journalists, and sometimes they may be very partisan, they may take positions that are impossible to fight because they have all that firepower. They can publish what they want overnight. They can say complete nonsense, but it carries their name that has so much prestige. And then it can take forever to kind of fix the record or try to correct some of the very egregious things that they stated that were completely wrong. Don't get me wrong. I think that most, perhaps all of these people are well-intentioned, and they do see it as a mission that they want to help the community and to accelerate science and science dissemination. So perhaps they have the best of intentions, but very often they just move into unchecked activism and advocacy and very unilateral, one-sided approaches. So do we take them, please don't write what you write or don't publish? That's hard to do. I think at a minimum, we should see more transparency on what is their background and also what kind of conflicts they have. Many of them have overt conflicts of activism and advocacy. They are in public view, but who has time to go and search and find that, oh goodness, this is an activist for that cause, and it has a 5-page feature in Nature that they published overnight, and goodness, now it will take 50 years to set the record straight. So at least transparency. Most journals do not have even a section to declare the conflicts of interest of their editors and their staff journalists, let alone their declared advocacy and activism. I don't see activism as a sin. It could be something that they should be congratulated on if they fight for a worthy cause. And in fact, they should be proud to say, I'm an activist for this. But people should know that this is an activist, not a scientist talking. And it makes a huge difference. And then I would argue that perhaps many of these journals should also have more balanced views. Probably they should cut back on how much power they give some of their editors. There's editors who have published literally thousands of pieces. And they're very smart people. I'm sure that they're among the most smart people in the world. And they should be able to say what they want to say, but I don't think that they need to take thousands of pieces in their journal pages. This becomes some sort of editorial self-fulfilling prophecy or editorial nepotism if they just choose a couple of people who they feel are in the very same wavelength. Whatever is written doesn't carry their own signature, but it still says what they want to say. I think we have a major problem in the interface of science with science journalism. The science journalism should be our allies, should help science. And I think at times it devastates science. And I feel very sorry for that.
John, so looking at this, how do you think the overall science publishing ecosystem should look like? Because we know by the very journal that you publish this paper on, that is PLOS ONE Medicine, that you like different stuff. So how do you see these new type of journals coming in? How do you see them fitting into the overall ecosystem? And how do you think it should be? Should we get rid of journals altogether? Should we give them a different role? What do you think should be the ideal scenario?
I was very much in favor of all open science initiatives from the get-go. And actually, this is the reason why I published the 2005 paper in PLOS Medicine. And I have been supportive of similar initiatives. At the same time, I feel that I was probably wrong, or at least I could not see that much of the open science nomenclature when it comes to publishing would end up being hijacked. And hijacked meaning that of all the wonderful things that we could get from open science, which would include having access to raw data, more extensive sharing, having more visible and more detailed protocols, statistical analysis plans, more collaborative spirit, team science, meta-analysis of individual level information, and more open declaration of conflicts, of who has funded what. There were lots of things that we could get. What we got was mostly article processing fees of several $1,000s and sometimes over $10,000 to have your work published, which is really draining the very limited budgets of researchers, even more so those who have smaller teams and are struggling to be able to survive and continue to do research. It is also draining funds from funding agencies that are under other types of pressure to cut back on their budgets. Eventually, publishers benefit from that, and this is not just the traditional, let's say, open science publishers. Practically now, everyone who is in the publishing mode can profit from this. The publishing industry is a $30-40 billion industry and has a profit margin of 30-40%, basically with free labor from peer reviewers and most people who serve as editors, and with very high article publication fees. So I think that moving forward, the future of journals, of peer-reviewed journals, is something that is debated and will continue to be debated. I don't think that we have just one ideal recipe, and I think that science communication can work with different recipes, provided that each one of them is set in a set of circumstances that we can get more unbiased and more transparent and more reproducible evidence. So it can be done with different models. I'm willing to try different models. I'm willing to try and experiment and compare, hopefully, different models. There's models that pay most attention to improving peer review. And we know that peer review is very problematic, and it does improve some papers. It does make some papers worse, and probably most papers are not affected meaningfully by peer review. So there's plenty of room to improve in that regard. There's other models that even say, well, just get things published without peer review. And perhaps we will have peer review downstream, like preprints are the norm in physical sciences. They're pretty common now in social sciences and in medicine as well, even though in many fields they're not so mainstream. Now, you can get peer review. You can get even more peer review with preprints if you wish. In theory, you can have the entire world criticize your paper upon its first appearance in a preprint server. The reality is that the vast majority of papers never attract any attention as preprints. Maybe a bot will notice you, but no human being will spend more than a Twitter X a few characters length of attention. And even that may be more than what the average preprint gets. So I'm interested in testing different ways. Nothing is fixed. People who say that our system is well tested and has been with us forever, that's not true. Science has utilize very different ways of communication and appraising of evidence over the centuries. Peer review is a rather new construct, in fact, at least in the way that it has become mainstream in the last century. So let's try. Let's not oversell again, because I see many of these efforts try to make a case that we will be so disruptive that we will change science once and for all. And I'm very skeptical when I see such big promises. Most of the changes will be incremental. I think that they would need to be decided by grassroots movements where scientists see more benefit. And hopefully these decisions will not be affected by influences that are outside science and do not care that much about science, but they care about other things like making money or tilting science to a direction that is favorable for them. That's always the danger, that whatever becomes dominant is not shaped by the needs of science, but by outsiders.
In that same line, John, have you seen any progress from the date of the publishing of this paper, 2005, to today? Have you seen anything? What have you seen a significant change in these 20 years of science progress?
There's a lot of change over the last 20 years. The indicators of let's say good science have improved in many fields. Many research practices have been adopted more widely. Back in 2005, if you were to take a random paper, it would be less than 1% likely that you would have access to the raw data. In medicine, this has become about 20% in the life sciences. In other fields, it is also far more common than it used to be. In economics, at least the top journals have made access to raw data more like a default, even though still many data sets are not shared for various reasons. And we see progress in other areas. We see progress in registration of protocols, especially for research that needs to be registered. It is prospective, it is experimental. You need to tell people what is going to be done. We see a lot of progress in some transparency indicators, like having placeholders for conflicts and for funding disclosures as the default. It doesn't mean that the information that we get disclosed is complete or accurate, but at least journals are routinely asking for that. And we see more efforts in sharing code and algorithms and making them work in real time, as opposed to trying to discover how that analysis was done. So there is progress. At the same time, science is moving very fast. We have far more papers published. We have more than 7 million papers published every year now. And we have probably more growth in fields that, on average, they're less cognizant and less interested in some of these extra safeguards that have become available in many other fields. So if you were to take a random paper in 2025 versus a random paper in 2005, I'm not sure that it would be more likely that a new discovery being claimed would be true. And some of that is due to the fact that we have this asymmetrical growth in fields and in domains and in research environments that do not care that much or at all about these credibility aspects. To some extent, it would also be a consequence of asking more difficult questions, more complex questions, probably questions that have a lower prior of getting something discovered. So the low-hanging fruit are becoming more and more sparse. Big effects, big treatment effects are less likely probably over time, and very strong associations that would even have some sort of causality likelihood are also becoming less likely as we search more vast spaces of information. And also conflicts probably have become more potent over time. In some areas, not in every area, but some scientific areas that were blessed not to have people interested in them because no one was saying that they would make money out of it and they would have power. Now they're cursed to attract attention. And if they attract attention and they can shape the world, lots of powerful entities will try to make them get results that is to their favor.
All right, this is depressing, but I unfortunately agree with everything you just said, especially the fact that we're looking for much smaller effect sizes nowadays than we used to. We used to be, especially my discipline, economics, we used to be interested in, you had titles like The Economics of Corruption, and they would show you just the effect of growth on corruption, just cross-country like analysis in the 90s. And of course, the correlation was huge, and you were likely to detect the effect with even a small sample size. But now we're interested in mechanism in a specific setting, and you would need like a super large sample to actually be able to detect the effect, but you don't have that. And I think actually we're seeing an increase in p hacking, publication bias, and questionable research practices in many disciplines. But one thing I want to ask you and get your brain on, and this is something we discussed in a previous episode last week, and it's about AI and this idea that potentially AI is just going to generate a lot of bad papers, that paper mills could just explode. They're already huge. There's tons of predatory journals, but it could just become much more prevalent. And also that a lot of the AI that we're getting, for instance, ChatGPT or it could be Gemini, or are being trained on papers that are published and on data encodes that always find an effect significant at the 5% level. Shocking. They're being trained on this. And something we started talking last week on the podcast was this idea that potentially people are going to be using AI more and more for their analysis, their codes, for just in general conducting their research, are going to be using tools without even noticing that are actually potentially biased in some ways or another. Or they could write prompts such as, "This is a great paper you've just written. Thank you so much, ChatGPT. Can you make it significant at the 5% level, please?" And the please is going to be very important. What are your thoughts on this? And where do you see the future of research with AI?
AI can be used in meaningful ways and it can be misused in many different ways. And I think we have seen a lot of misuse already. And we have some empirical data suggesting that maybe 1 out of 7 papers submitted currently to journals like Wiley has released some preliminary information, and other publishers are also working on that. So 1 out of 7 papers are fake products of it. Now, these papers might be detected in a journal that uses some AI detecting technology, but not all journals would have that. The sensitivity and specificity would not be perfect. My
And it's
mentor,
expensive. And who's going to pay for this?
so Drummond Rennie has written that a paper will be published if you try to publish it. It will be published no matter what. There's no way to stop it. And there's so many tens of thousands of journals out there that are willing to publish anything, including predatory journals and journals that have absolutely no concern about quality, that it will appear probably somehow, somewhere, and may even be cited, may
Yes.
even be cited by citation cartels, or may even be cited by some legitimate scientists who just cannot tell that this is a fake paper or a highly problematic one.
Oh, AI is going to cite AI papers at one point.
Yes.
For sure.
Yes, so it will become very complex. We have a lot of pollution of the literature already, I believe, and it's likely to get even worse. And we will have some of these tools used to detect that pollution and hopefully get rid of that pollution, but it will be an ongoing fight, and I'm not sure what eventually will prevail. There's lots of risks for the scientific literature based on AI. One is that it pollutes and tries to depollute scientific literature. A second risk is that AI may move much of the most interesting science outside the scientific literature, because, for example, it will be work that will be done by big tech and other corporations using AI tools and using their computational capacity that is much bigger than of any university or research institution. They would not want to or have any interest in publishing the results. So they will create a new science of sorts that is much bigger and much more computationally intensive and perhaps more rich than the science that will be circulating in the traditional journals and where academics and traditional researchers may be playing. And literally, we might be just playing at that time if really what matters happens outside of that corpus. It will be more like a toy for, some academics need to play with their little toys. That's okay, but who cares? Nobody should care about them. That's the second option. And we can see both. We can see a highly polluted toy eventually becoming the remnant of what used to be the scientific corpus. We could also have positive evolutions. We could have evolutions where AI may indeed improve some aspects of our ability to do science, much like any tool, much like any statistical software. If you know how to use it, and if you know how to really multiply your capacity, that might be a good thing. We have used other tools in the past to really go into scale for some problems that were unimaginable to deal with in the past. We had Nobel Prizes given for an AI application practically that for decades we could not really make much progress. And suddenly you have these new tools being able to make a dramatic improvement. So all of that is possible. In most fields, I don't think that the remaining problems are such that AI will make a huge difference, to be honest, because they're probably as good to test and assess and improve with a plain logistic regression or with a very sophisticated deep neural network or with any fancy new generation generative AI. It's just going to be no better than that. And it's going to be a mix of these scenarios. And I'm not sure which one will be the dominant one. And I think it's up to us to see which one we want to allow to happen and which one we will allow to grow and which one we will invest more and which one we'll ban perhaps in some settings. Who knows? It's up to us. I don't see it as a doomed future. I think there's good elements and bad elements. I see more bad elements, to be honest. But we can sort them out if we are determined and if we really want to do that.
This is super interesting. John, I think we are at time, but I wanted to give you like the opportunity and you able to make some final remarks. How do you see the future? I think you just answered that, but I think there are good things about this stuff. I share your view of concern and that we should get on top of this stuff, but I like your optimistic way as well. So before we leave, any last remarks?
I think it's wonderful to try to do science. It's wonderful to think about errors, mistakes, biases, the ones that I make to start with, and try to fix those and remedy the situation. Science has been fascinating. I anticipate that it will continue being fascinating. So I agree we should try to be optimistic, but disasters can still happen.
Thank you so much, Don. And thanks for all the work you've done over the past decades. It's been
Thank
truly
you so
amazing
much.
to look at your work and inspire.
Thank you
For
so
sure.
much. I hope not all of it is wrong.
Some of it. I'm still trying to figure out which papers I can trust. Some of them I'll be the trash and I was like, John was wrong there, but it's okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Have a
Thanks,
wonderful
John.
day.
Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.